Hi, my name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe and I'm a Sizzix designer. Today we're going to be looking at my die, the Hex Star. I love to work with this, one because it makes a really beautiful scrap quilt that you can see hanging behind me, but also we get to learn a new technique. Learning the Y seam. Don't be afraid of it. I'm going to show you step by step how to get through to make this beautiful block. And we're going to kind of jump right in and show you how many layers you can cut out at a time. Today we're using the Big Shot Plus. You can also use the Big Shot Pro using this 9-inch platform. If you have the Big Shot Plus, know that you can also use the 9-inch platform and the 6-inch dies on this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and start laying my pieces out. On the Hex Star, we do need only 6 points to get all the way around the block itself. So I'm going to lay my pieces out. You can cut 8 layers of them at a time. I got everything positioned where I want it to. I'm making sure not to have a lot of fabric hanging over the edge because I need for the width of the die to go through the machine itself. And roll it through with one pass and I get all my pieces cut out. Got a couple extra little blue pieces for the corner squares. There's a couple different variations that you can do with this that I'm going to show you today. One is going to be making the block itself into just a hexagon shape. And then we have the options of laying your corners in so that you're just making a block quilt so that you can make the quilt that's behind me. Now let me show you the easiest way to put this block together. Okay, so when we hear Y seams, people get all afraid because they don't quite know how to do that. But I am going to walk you through how to get perfect results with this block every time. Okay, so we have our points, I guess we can call those the points. And we have our quarter square triangles. We're always going to sew the quarter square triangle to the right side of the point. Okay? Anytime you do a Y seam meaning not a straight seam where there's going to be a bend in what you're sewing, you want to be able to start and stop sewing at a 1/4 inch. So I have some of these already sewn together so that you could see I start at a 1/4 inch in and I sew to the outside of the block. And I do that because I need the fabric to be able to move and pivot when I'm sewing down and sewing that seam together. Okay, so I'm going to sew this last piece together. You can see that the die already cuts the dog ears off the end of the points, which means that when I'm lying this on here ready to sew, I'm going to know exactly where I'm lining up my segments of fabric. I'm going to start at a 1/4 inch in. You can eyeball that or you can put a ruler down and mark your 1/4 inch so that you know it's going to fit exactly where you want it to. And I'm always going to do a back stitch point because when you do sew your Y seams together, you don't want to have a hole there or you don't want your threads to pull loose. So always do a little back stitch when you're sewing that. Okay, after I sew my segment together, I'm also going to press my seams open. For this last one, I'm just going to finger press it open. Okay, so there, all of my points are sewn with the brown triangle going to the right-hand side of the point. And now we're going to put 3 segments together and then the other 3 segments together. Once we have those segments together, then we're going to be able to do this final seam. The reason this is easier to do it in this form, instead of sewing all of your points together and trying to put this 1/4 square triangle in, is the tighter that angle is, the harder you are to get a perfect fit, make the blocks laid nicely together. So the wider angle, more control you have in pivoting and letting the fabrics bend. Okay, so now we're going to put these 2 pieces right sides together. Again, the tips are dog-eared, so we know exactly where we're going to line it up in the middle of the block, which is where we're going to start sewing. We're going to sew all the way down, and we're going to leave our needle exactly where this seam is pressed open. Now, this is why I press those seams open and why I put this block together in this order, because that gives me visually the perfect cue of where I need to stop my needle before I then pivot and sew to the outside of the block. Okay, so let's put that under the needle so you can see exactly what I'm talking about there. When I line that up with my dog ears, also you'll see that I have yet an extra 1/4 inch of fabric underneath there. You have to remember when you're doing these to let the feed dogs take the fabric through the sewing machine. If you start pulling that top layer or the bottom layer, you might get to that point to leave your needle and you're not going to have any fabric underneath there. A lot of people don't realize how much they're pulling and tugging on their fabrics, but you have to remember to let the machine take the fabric through. Okay, so if you've laid these exactly where it needs to go, you know that you're going to have enough room for your pivot point. There should always be a 1/4 inch underneath that seam. So starting from the edge of my fabric, I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch, I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to sew up till I reach that point and leaving the needle exactly in the seam that's been pressed open. My needle is exactly in that seam. Because I've pressed that open and because I started from a 1/4 inch in, the fabric lays very nicely underneath the needle. And then I can set my presser foot back down and I can continue to sew. All the way off the edge of the fabric. I go back again and I'm going to press all of those seams open. For the second, I'm just going to finger press this and then we'll get the 3rd section on there. Just one more time so you can see how that goes. So here's your 2 segments together. We're going to add one more section on there. I'm going to fit in together like that. There's my Y seam. Right sides together. If your seams are pressed open, you already have a natural angle where this is going to rest right up against. If you take care to line up with the points, the way that they're trimmed, when you finish sewing this seam, you're naturally going to have a 1/4 inch over where those seams join, and that's what's going to help save your points when you sew the 2 halves together. One of the things I often hear when I'm teaching is that they sew their points off and they don't know how to get that perfect point on the end. So if you really look at the way that these pieces are already cut, all the information you need there is going to give you a very successful block. So starting from the edge of my fabric, lining that up, fitting it right in where it's supposed to lay. I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. Again, I'm looking for my 1/4 inch overlap where the seam is pressed open, and I will leave my needle exactly in that seam when I get to that point. I'm going to hand crank my needle so it's exactly in its place, and now I can pivot. The fabric stay perfectly nice underneath there because I have not sewn off the edge of my fabric at that Y seam point. And now I'm going to sew out to the outside. And backstitch. Okay, so then I'm going to go back and I'm going to press all of my seams open because everything's going to lay nice and flat now. And because I've laid these out where I'm supposed to, I still have a 1/4 inch of fabric beyond this middle one where the points come together, where these 2 pieces are coming together. And that's how when I sew these 2 halves together that I'm not going to lose all the points on my stars. Okay, now we've sewn 3 of the units together to make 2 halves. And this is what we're going to have to look at. So this is the last seam that we're going to start sewing together, and then it's going to finish our hexagon. So when I want to sew these together, I'm going to put this right sides together. And let me just repeat again what I had said before about lining up your blocks when you sew them, meaning this middle piece, after I've sewn the other 2 on, that's where my point ends. And I still have a 1/4 inch of fabric that goes beyond that point. So when I'm lining up this half with this half, I'm going to put a pin exactly through where that point is. Okay, the pin is coming straight through that point, and I'm going to line it up and put the pin through the point on my other half, because those are the seams that we want to line up. And if I've put a pin exactly where that needs to be, when I sew, I'll know exactly where I need to cross when I'm sewing that in together. And that way I know that I'm not going to sew off my point on my block. So I put a pin in there, and you can see I've left it kind of stand in there vertically. That way I know that they're going to line up. I'm going to take the second pin and just stick it to the side so that those 2 points where I pinned it are going to stay put. Now when I sew this, I will take this pin out, but most people like to start from the outside and sew all the way to the opposite side, but we're not going to do that. We're going to start a little bit beyond the center, a couple inches is fine, and I'm going to sew across and set that middle point where you have multiple seams that are coming together. and then finish and sew to the outside. Then I will flip the block and I'll start from where I initially started and finish sewing to the other side. That way you're not pushing all of this fabric in your seams, as most people have learned when they've tried to do Y seams. You get to the point where all the layers are and the seams start to jump, and the machine wants to jump over all of those layers as well. So if I start that and set those seams straight away, then that's going to help us have a much prettier center of our block. Okay, so I have that pinned in place. I'm going to put my extra little pins there so that hold that, so my centers don't move. Again, start from 2 inches before. I'm going to sew, and I'm going to leave my needle in the seam that's pressed open again before I pivot and sew to the outside. I'm going to do a little back stitch. I'm not going to sew over my pin. I'm going to pull that out, and I know exactly where I need to cross. Take my other pin out. I'm just going to pause a minute. I'm going to make sure my block is lined up where it's supposed to be. The same thing that we were doing before about having the seam pressed open. There's always a 1/4 inch fabric. The pieces line up perfectly if you've sewn your 1/4 inch seam. I can put a pin in there to hold that if I want to, or I can hold it with my fingers. I'm very used to doing it that way. And I'm going to stop by leaving that needle exactly in that seam. So that's where it's really important. If you put this block together in the order that I showed you, that means that that seam is always going to be on the top, so you will know exactly where you need to leave your needle for your pivot on your Y seam. So now I get to pivot. I'm going to line up my edges of my block, lay my fabric down under that needle, and finish sewing to the outside. Okay, so that's that first segment. Now I'm going to flip it, and I'm going to start sewing where I started before, and then I'm going to do the same thing that we just did. I'm going to sew, leave the needle into the seam that's pressed open, and pivot and finish the block. There's my needle right where I want it to be. Now I get to pivot, line up my edges. Remember, those dog ears show you exactly where you need to line up your block and your pieces. I'm not pulling my fabrics. I'm letting the feed dogs take the fabric through the machine. And now I can go back and I can press that final long seam open, and everything will lay very nice and flat. Okay, so you can see my points are still completely there. And I'm going to go back and I'll press those seams open, and I have my Hex Star block all ready to go. So I could do a whole quilt that way. I have these little pieces that are laying here that are bonus, but if I made a whole quilt, I could be putting all of these together into one complete panel. So, which means you're going to be doing a lot more Y seams, but now that you already know how to do it, this will be easy for you to do. So if I wanted to make that quilt, okay, for instance, if that was how this was going to go, I'm not going to try to sew stuff like this. I'm going to sew all my straight rows together. Okay, so if I have a whole row of hexagons and a whole row of hexagons here, I'm going to come back and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch out, all the straight seams on all these blocks all the way down. If you're going to make this hexagon quilt, every seam putting these blocks together is a Y seam. So every single time you start, it's a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch out. Okay, so I would do a whole row that way. I would do my second row the same way, 1/4 inch in, 1/4 inch out. And also, because of the way the star points land, you have little seams that you can line up each time, and it's a good guide for you to know how you're lining up the blocks. So then after I've made my complete rows, then I'll come back and I will go Y seam, Y seam, Y seam, Y seam, Y seam, all the way down the whole row of the quilt. That's the easiest way of construction for sewing hexagon together, either these large sizes or if you're even working with small sizes. Okay, so now let's look at the other option. The quilt that's behind me shows this block, right like that, but it's been squared out. So on the die we have the extra pieces for you to line up and to sew to the outside. Then you have no more Y seams to do. Now you finish them out into a square and you can completely make the rest of this block. So again, looking at where those dog ear points are that the die so nicely cuts for us, I can lay these right sides together. You notice the angle of your block. The dog ears fit exactly where they need to go. Right in there. Okay, so I can just sew my 1/4 inch seam on all 4 of those corners, and then I have the blocks that are hanging behind me on the wall. So always starting and stopping on these seams, doing your back stitch. It's just a nice fast way to finish the quilt if you don't want to have to do any more Y seams. Here's the block. It's all pressed. It's looking beautiful. This is the same block that you're going to see hanging behind me here on the wall. I can finish the block in an easy way by just putting those corners on the outside. Remember that you can also put this block together just by sewing the hexagons together now that you know how to do your Y seams. Remembering those quick little tricks, starting from a 1/4 inch in, sewing from the outside, and also paying attention to the order in which you sew those pieces together. So don't be afraid to play with those Y seams now. Go out and make a beautiful quilt.